The morning they told Calvin Mercer his daughter might not wake up, he was standing in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, shaking hands with men whose names he would not remember by afternoon. His phone buzzed twice before he looked at it. The message was from his housekeeper, Pauline. 4 words, "Call me. It's Abby." He excused himself from the room, walked to the corridor, and dialed. By the time Pauline finished speaking, Calvin had already stopped listening. He heard the word seizure. He heard the word unconscious. And then a low humming filled his ears, the kind that comes not from outside but from somewhere behind the eyes. And he understood, with the quiet certainty that sometimes arrives before the grief does, that nothing else in his life would matter again until he knew whether his daughter was going to be all right. Abigail was 11 years old. She had her mother's eyes and Calvin's stubbornness, which meant she had more than her fair share of both. She liked to read with a flashlight under the covers after he'd told her to sleep. She kept a notebook of cloud formations she spotted from their backyard in Forest Hill. She called him Dad in the mornings and Calvin when she was annoyed with him, which made him laugh every time, even when he tried not to. She had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with a rare neurological condition, one of those names that takes a specialist 3 attempts to say correctly. Progressive cortical disruption. The doctors at Sick Kids had been thorough, cautious, and ultimately honest in the way that the very best doctors are honest. They told him what they knew, were careful about what they didn't, and gently prepared him for outcomes he spent the next 8 months refusing to accept. He had not been prepared for this. He was never prepared for any of it, no matter how many times he sat in beige consultation rooms and nodded at charts. The hospital was 30 minutes from the tower, but Calvin covered it in 18. He walked through the automatic doors of the neurology ward with his jacket still buttoned, his tie straight, his face arranged into the expression he had learned over years of crisis management. Composed, focused, present. It was the only thing he knew how to do in moments like this. Fall back on structure. Hold the shape of yourself when everything inside has already come undone. Dr. Anita Vasquez met him in the hallway outside Abby's room. She was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular manner of someone who had delivered difficult news enough times to have made a kind of peace with it. Not callousness, but steadiness. Calvin had always respected her for that, even when he hated what she had to say. She told him that Abby had experienced a significant neurological episode that morning, that the scans showed increased activity in the regions they had already been watching, that they had stabilized her, that she was sleeping, that she was. The pause before the next word cost Vasquez something. He could see it. Comfortable. What does that mean? Calvin asked. Vasquez looked at him the way people look at someone standing too close to an edge. It means we've done everything we can do here, Calvin. We need to talk about next steps. He already knew what next steps meant. He had known for weeks, in the way you know a thing you refuse to let become real. Next steps meant managing. Next steps meant quality time and comfort measures, and a conversation about making memories. Next steps meant they had stopped looking for a way through. He sat in the chair beside Abby's bed for 4 hours without moving. She looked very small against the white hospital pillow. Her notebook was on the nightstand. Someone had brought it from home, probably Pauline, who loved Abby in the practical, unsentimental way that was somehow more sustaining than most other kinds of love. The notebook was open to a page covered in pencil drawings of cumulus clouds. He held her hand. He said her name once, very quietly. She didn't stir. The afternoon his lawyer called to discuss the paperwork for a long-term care facility, Calvin walked out of his own house without knowing where he was going. He ended up 6 blocks away, on a bench in a small park near the reservoir, still in his dress shoes. The sky was doing something spectacular. A long orange burn along the horizon, the kind Abby would have named and catalogued, and Calvin sat there not looking at it. A child appeared at the far end of the path. She was maybe 10 or 11, moving quickly, carrying a canvas bag that was clearly too heavy for her. She wore a coat that was clean but too thin for the October wind, and her boots were the kind that had been resoled at least once. She stopped at the park's little water fountain, set her bag down, and drank for a long time. Then she opened the bag and took out a small jar and a folded cloth, and she sat on the ground right there on the path, cross-legged without self-consciousness, and began sorting through what appeared to be dried plants. bundles of something tied with twine, small glass bottles, flat squares of bark. Calvin watched her for a moment, not because he meant to, but because there was something in the way she worked. Careful, unhurried, completely absorbed. That was unusual. "What are you doing?" he asked. The words came out before he'd decided to say them. She looked up. She had a serious, open face and dark eyes that assessed him without any trace of wariness. "Sorting out Gran's order," she said, as if this explained everything. "She makes things. I help her deliver. What kinds of things?" The girl tilted her head, considering whether he was worth explaining it to. Apparently he passed because she held up one of the bundles. Elderflower, mullein, yarrow, different ones for different things. "Gran's been making remedies since before my mum was born. She learned from her grandmother, who learned it from the people up north." Calvin looked at the jar in her hand. "Does it work?" The girl set the jar down carefully. "Depends what you mean by work," she said. "It doesn't do what a hospital does, but sometimes the hospital can't do what Gran does either." He didn't know why he kept talking to her. He supposed he had nothing else to do with the hour, and she didn't seem bothered by him, and there was something clarifying about sitting in a park talking to a child who sorted dried plants with the seriousness of a pharmacist. Her name was Petra. She was 11. She lived with her grandmother, Celestine, in a small apartment above a coin laundry on a street Calvin had driven past 1,000 times without ever noticing. Her grandmother was from the Maritimes originally, Cape Breton, Petra said, and before that her people were from somewhere further north than that, though Petra said this in a way that suggested the geography was less important than the lineage. "Is your grandmother well?" Calvin asked. "She's old," Petra said, in a tone that meant she is well enough, and she is exactly who she is meant to be. He stood up eventually. He thanked her, though he wasn't sure what for. She nodded at him in that unsettling way children sometimes have of treating adults as perfect equals, gathered her bag, and continued down the path. He stood there for a while after she'd gone, watching the last of the orange drain out of the sky. He went back to the park the next afternoon. He told himself he was just walking. He sat on the same bench. Petra did not come. He went back the day after that. She came again, same canvas bag, same deliberate walk. This time she sat on the other end of his bench without being invited, which he took as a compliment. They talked about nothing in particular for 20 minutes. He told her about a construction project near the waterfront. She told him that her school had a broken radiator, and they all wore their coats in class. He told her about Abby without meaning to. He wasn't sure when he started. One moment he was describing the fog he'd been living in, and then he was saying his daughter's name and the name of the condition, and Petra was listening with the full, still attention that certain children have and most adults have forgotten. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gran might know something." "About what?" "About that kind of thing. The brain things." She said it simply, not as a pitch or a promise, just as a fact she was offering in case it was useful. "She helped a man on our floor once. He couldn't speak after his stroke. She worked with him for weeks. He still doesn't speak perfectly, but he speaks." Calvin looked at his hands. He was a man who had built a company from a rented office and 3 employees. He trusted systems. He trusted evidence and process and the measurable. He had spent 9 months putting his faith in institutions with good reputations and expensive equipment. "I appreciate that," he said, "but Abby's situation is very complex. It's neurological. It's not something that—" "I know," Petra said. "I'm not saying it'll fix everything. Gran never says that. She'd be the first to tell you she's not a doctor." She paused. "I'm just saying, if you wanted to meet her, I think she'd talk to you." He said he would think about it. He thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he called Dr. Vasquez and told her what the girl had said. There was a brief silence on the line. "I can't tell you what to do, Calvin," Vasquez said. "What I can tell you is that what we've been doing isn't producing the results we hoped for. I'm not going to discourage you from exploring other things." It was the most careful kind of permission. He took it. Celestine was not what he expected, which meant he wasn't sure what he'd expected, only that it wasn't this. She was a small, stout woman in her late 70s, with white hair braided down her back, and a kitchen that smelled of things Calvin couldn't name, warm and complex, and faintly medicinal, the way old herbalist shops sometimes smell, or church halls. She was sitting at her kitchen table when Petra brought him in, and she didn't stand up or extend her hand or perform any of the social rituals Calvin was used to. She just looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Sit down," and he sat. She asked him about Abby, not about the diagnosis, about Abby, what she liked, how she slept, whether she dreamed, what her appetite had been like before the episode started, whether she startled easily, whether she liked music or found it agitating. Calvin answered everything. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he knew all the answers, that in fact he knew his daughter's particular texture better than he had given himself credit for. Celestine listened with her eyes half closed, which was not inattention but concentrations. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands folded on the table. "I can't promise you anything," she said. "I want to be very clear about that. What I do is old. It's not magic, and it's not medicine, and it's not a miracle. It's knowledge that's been passed down a long time, about how the body talks and how to listen to it. Some of it the doctors understand now, some of it they don't, not yet." She opened her eyes fully. "But I'll ask you one thing. What has the fear been doing to her? The fear of being sick, the fear of not getting better, the fear she sees in your face when you think she's not looking?" Calvin said nothing. "That's what I thought," Celestine said. "Bring her to me, not to be cured, just to be known. That's where we start." He brought Abby the following Saturday. She was quiet in the car, which was unusual. Abby was rarely quiet, even when she was unwell, and he realized the silence was not listlessness but observation. She was watching the streets change as they moved from their neighborhood to Celestine's, cataloging in her way. "Who is she?" Abby asked. "A woman who knows things," Calvin said. "What kind of things? Old things?" Abby thought about this. "Good old things or bad old things?" "Good," he said. "Very good." Celestine greeted Abby differently than she'd greeted Calvin. She came to the door this time. She crouched down to Abby's level, which cost her something in her knees, and she didn't let it show, and she looked at her with the same unrushed attention she brought to everything. "You must be the cloud watcher," she said. Abby's eyes went wide. "Petra told me. She says you keep a notebook." Celestine smiled then, and it remade her face entirely. "I kept one too, when I was your age. Clouds and birds both. Come inside and tell me what the best cloud is." What happened over the next 6 weeks was not, Calvin would later struggle to explain, any one dramatic thing. It was accumulation. Celestine came to the hospital 3 times a week. She refused to let Calvin send a car. She took the bus, which struck him as entirely consistent with everything about her, and she would spend an hour with Abby, doing things that looked simple and were not. Gentle, careful work with her hands along Abby's neck and shoulders. Soft percussion along specific points that Celestine called listening places. Particular teas, prepared with the same precision Calvin applied to quarterly projections, the same compounds every day in the same order, timed to Abby's body temperature and sleep patterns. She also talked to Abby. Long, wandering conversations about ordinary things. Stories from Cape Breton, about the winter the bay froze solid, about her own grandmother, who had been delivered by a midwife during a blizzard and had come out already arguing. She told Abby that the body was not a broken machine to be fixed, but a living thing to be listened to. That sickness was partly the body talking too loudly about something it needed, that the listening was half the medicine. Petra came sometimes too, and she and Abby would sit by the window doing things that 11-year-olds do, drawing, arguing amicably about something on Abby's tablet, competing to identify clouds. Calvin watched them from the doorway once and felt something shift behind his sternum that he hadn't felt in months. There was a morning in week 4 when Abby woke up and said her head felt clearer. She said it the way children say things, flatly, as a statement of fact, not a declaration. "Dad, my head feels different, not fuzzy." He did not let himself hope, not yet. He had trained himself out of hope too many times, but Dr. Vasquez called him that same afternoon, having reviewed Abby's latest scans. She was careful with her language, as she always was. She said the activity in the affected regions had not increased. She said that in one area, the disruption appeared to have. She paused, stabilized. She said she wasn't drawing conclusions. She said she wanted to do more scans. She said, and her voice did something complicated here, that whatever he was doing in addition to the hospital's protocol, he should continue doing it. Calvin sat in his kitchen after the call and pressed his knuckles against his off and breathed until he trusted himself. There was a man in Calvin's orbit, a former business partner, someone he had once considered a friend, named Stuart Lennox, who had heard, through the particular underground channel of Toronto money, that Calvin was taking his daughter to see some folk healer on a side street off Roncesvalles. Stuart called him one morning, ostensibly to check in, and managed within 3 minutes to say the words unproven and vulnerable state and people who take advantage. He said it with the smooth concern of someone performing care, without feeling it, and Calvin recognized the voice because he had used that voice himself once in an earlier version of his life. He thanked Stuart and ended the call and did not return the next 3. What he understood, and what he could not have explained to Stuart or anyone like him, was that Celestine was not claiming to cure his daughter. She was not selling hope or packaging despair. She was doing something quieter and more radical than that. She was treating Abby like a person whose body was worth understanding, rather than a problem to be managed. And in the treating of her that way, something was happening. He didn't know what to call it. He didn't need to. By the end of November, Abby was sitting up for longer periods. Her speech, which had begun to slow in the weeks before, another symptom they had been watching with the particular dread of watching something inevitable, had steadied. She asked for her cloud notebook back. She asked whether they could visit the lakeshore, because she wanted to see if the ice was forming at the edges yet. They went on a Sunday, all 4 of them, Calvin, Abby, Petra, and Celestine, who wore a heavy wool coat the color of charcoal and walked without hurrying, and who stopped twice on the path to point out plants growing through the cracks in the pavement and tell Abby their names. Abby wrote them down. Petra told her she was a nerd in the affectionate way that is its own kind of acceptance. The lake was steel gray and immense and beautiful in the specific way Canadian winter water is beautiful, austere, patient, indifferent to human feeling in a way that Calvin had always found oddly comforting. Abby stood at the railing looking at it for a long time. Then she said, without turning around, "Dad, I want to learn what Celestine knows." Calvin looked at Celestine. Celestine was looking at the water, but the corner of her mouth moved. "Then you will," he said. On the walk back, Petra fell into step beside him. She had her canvas bag over her shoulder, as always. "Do you believe in it now?" she asked. The directness of children, it never stopped being startling. He thought about it honestly. "I believe in her," he said. "I believe in you. I believe in whatever it is that happened." He glanced at her. "Is that enough?" Petra considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "Gran says that's usually how it starts," she said. Dr. Vasquez told him in January that Abby's scans showed continued stabilization, that the trajectory they had feared, the one she had walked him toward in that first careful, courageous conversation, had not materialized, that she was not prepared to say the word remission. Not yet, not without more time. But she said something else, unprompted, as Calvin was putting on his coat to leave. "Whatever you've been doing," she said, "the whole picture, the hospital, the supplements you've been giving her, the other work, it's helping. I don't know exactly which part is doing what. Maybe that's not the right question." She looked at him over her reading glasses. The right question might just be, is she better? And I think the answer to that is yes. He drove home through the gray January streets and thought about a bench in a park and a girl with a canvas bag and an October sky that Abby would have known the name of. He thought about what it means to come to the end of what you know and discover that someone else knows something different, not better, not less, just different, carried in other hands, passed down along a longer and less documented line. He thought about Celestine saying, "That's where we start." The following spring, Abby presented a project at her school on traditional plant medicine in Canadian Indigenous and settler communities. She had spent 3 months on it. It was thorough, careful, and full of detail. The same qualities she brought to her cloud notebook now applied to something she had lived through rather than observed from a distance. Petra came to see her present it. She sat in the second row with her arms crossed and her expression neutral, which Calvin had learned meant she was pleased. Celestine did not come because school presentations were not her particular territory, but Abby called her that evening and read her the whole thing over the phone, slowly, and there were long pauses in which Celestine said nothing. And in those pauses was everything that did not need to be said. Calvin sat at the kitchen table listening to his daughter's voice move through the rooms of the house, clear, steady, alive, and he did something he had not done in a long time. He let himself be grateful. Not cautiously, not provisionally, not with one eye on what might still go wrong. Fully. The way Abby watched clouds, with her whole face turned up, not afraid of the sky.